August 23rd, 1305, London. A man is about to die in the most horrific way medieval England could devise. But this isn't just any execution. This is the death that would accidentally birth a nation. What King Edward thought would end Scottish resistance forever became the spark that ignited it. This is the story of William Wallace's final day, and why his gruesome death became an epic fail to silence a nation. But first, who was William Wallace? William Wallace wasn't born to be a legend. He was a minor nobleman's son from Renfrewshire, educated but completely unremarkable. Just another face in medieval Scotland, until King Edward Longshanks invaded in 1296 and ruined everyone's day. Now, you might be wondering how we got to this point. Well, it all started with a succession crisis that would make a soap opera jealous. When Scotland's king Alexander III died in 1286, his only heir was his 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Edward I saw an opportunity and arranged for her to marry his son, essentially planning to absorb Scotland through matrimony rather than conquest. Clever, right? Except Margaret died on the voyage to Scotland in 1290, leaving no clear heir. Suddenly, multiple Scottish nobles were claiming the throne, and they made the fatal mistake of asking Edward to arbitrate. Edward agreed, but only if they acknowledged him as Scotland's overlord first. Classic medieval power move. Edward chose John Balliol as king, expecting a puppet ruler. But Balliol had the audacity to actually try ruling Scotland independently. When he refused to support Edward's war against France, Edward snapped. In 1296, he invaded Scotland, stripped Balliol of his crown, and declared himself King of Scots. Because apparently, Edward believed in, if you want something done right, do it yourself. When England crushed Scottish independence, something awakened in Wallace. Maybe it was his father's death. Maybe his wife's murder by English soldiers, or maybe he just really didn't like being told what to do by people with terrible teeth and questionable hygiene. In 1297, this nobody did the impossible. At Stirling Bridge, Wallace's ragtag army of farmers and craftsmen destroyed a professional English force. Knights in full armor, getting schooled by guys who normally spent their days milking cows and fixing horseshoes. For one glorious year, a minor nobleman's son was guardian of all Scotland. But glory doesn't last, especially when you're medieval and don't have a good PR team. After his defeat at Falkirk in 1298, Wallace became a hunted man, spending 7 desperate years seeking foreign aid for his dying cause. That hunt was about to end. Near Glasgow, 1305, Wallace thought he was meeting an ally. Instead, Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight, was setting the perfect betrayal trap. The capture was swift. The man who'd once commanded armies was now dragged south to London in chains, knowing exactly what awaited him, because Edward had made his intentions crystal clear. Wallace would die in a way that would make every Scot think twice about rebellion. Well, clearly Edward didn't understand Scottish people very well. A mock trial in all but name was held at Westminster Hall on August 23rd. Everyone knew the verdict long before it began. Charged with treason against King Edward, Wallace's response was cold. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. Those words sealed his fate, but they also revealed something Edward had completely missed. You can't betray a king you never served. Wallace saw himself as a free Scotsman, not an English subject. The judges weren't impressed. The sentence was death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, reserved for the worst traitors in English law, or as Edward liked to call it, Tuesday. But this wasn't just an execution. This was going to be a show, from Westminster to Smithfield, roughly 4 miles through London streets. Wallace wouldn't walk this distance. Oh no, that would be too dignified. He'd be dragged. Tied to a horse's tail, stripped naked, Wallace was pulled across cobblestone streets while crowds jeered and threw stones. Witnesses said something remarkable. Despite everything, Wallace never broke. No begging, no pleading for mercy. Even as his body was torn by the rough stones, he remained defiant, either incredibly brave or he'd reached that point where you're so angry you stop feeling pain. When they reached Smithfield, thousands had gathered. London was about to witness justice. or, as it turns out, accidentally host the world's most counterproductive motivational seminar. What happened next was designed to send a message across Scotland. The sentence was specific: hanging until nearly dead, disembowelment while still alive, beheading and quartering. The hanging came first, but only until unconsciousness, not death. Wallace was revived for what came next. Chroniclers recorded that Wallace remained conscious throughout ordeals that would have broken most men. When offered mercy in exchange for submission to Edward, his response was the same. He had never been Edward's subject to betray. The disembowelment followed, the punishment for treason under English law. This wasn't just brutality for its own sake, it was symbolic justice in the medieval mind. By removing and burning his entrails, they were literally tearing out what they saw as his treacherous heart. Finally came the beheading, the one merciful stroke in this theatre of cruelty, mercifully ending his suffering and releasing him from a pain that had gone far beyond what any human should endure. But Edward wasn't finished. Wallace's body was quartered, each piece sent to a different Scottish city, his head to London Bridge, limbs to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. The head was dipped in oil and spiked on the London Bridge to serve as a remainder. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy England. The message received was something entirely different. Edward thought he'd ended Scottish resistance. Instead, he'd just created its greatest symbol. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, except the gasoline was a Scottish martyr, and the fire was an entire nation's rage. News of Wallace's execution spread across Scotland like wildfire, but instead of fear, it sparked rage. Instead of submission, it inspired defiance. Edward had essentially sent every Scot a personal invitation to rebellion. Robert the Bruce, who'd been sitting on the fence about claiming the Scottish throne, suddenly found his resolve. Within months, he was crowned King of Scots. Within a year, he was winning battles Edward thought impossible. At Bannockburn in 1314, Bruce's army didn't just defeat the English, they crushed them so thoroughly that Edward II fled the field. Scottish independence was won, and England learned a valuable lesson about the Scottish attention span when it comes to holding grudges. The man Edward executed to end Scottish dreams had become the eternal symbol of Scottish freedom. William Wallace's execution was meant to be the final chapter of Scottish independence. Instead, it became the first page of a new story. 700 years later, we still remember the name William Wallace, not for how he died, but for what his death represented: the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to be conquered. Sometimes, the greatest victory comes through the ultimate sacrifice. If you enjoyed watching, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Thank you and see you on the next one.